Αγαπητοί φίλοι, σας καλωσορίζω για ακόμη μια φορά σε μια διάλεξη της σειράς Venizelos Library Talks. Η σημερινή διάλεξη είναι ξεχωριστή για 4 λόγους. Είναι η τελευταία διάλεξη της σειράς, τουλάχιστον για αυτή την περίοδο. Είναι η πρώτη που γίνεται διαδικτυακά στις φιλόξενες σελίδες του Βήματος. Έχει ένα πολύ ιδιαίτερο θέμα που θα μας παρουσιάζει ένας ιδιαίτερα πρικισμένος και πολυσκηδής ομιλητής, ο Bruce Clark. Και τέλος, ολοκληρώνεται όχι με την συνηθισμένη δεξίωση, αλλά με μουσική. Επιτρέψτε μου να γίνω λίγο πιο αναλυτική μιλώντας στα αγγλικά, καθώς το κοινό μας απόψε είναι πραγματικά διεθνές. Friends, at the beginning of 2019, we decided to launch a series of talks at the British Ambassador's residence in Athens, appropriately titled the Venizelos Library Talks. I've been very happy to see during the past year that the Athenian and wider public showed an interest in this series, and our guests came to the Venizelos Library to listen to many distinguished speakers presenting their views and the fruits of their research on issues as diverse as British wartime propaganda or the influence of classicism in shaping the identity of Edinburgh, the Athens of the North, or presenting the biography of a modern nation, that is Greece. And of course, in 4 talks, speakers referred very appropriately to either the life or policy issues connected to Eleftherios Venizelos. As we are now approaching 2021, we're turning our attention to organising lectures related to the 200th anniversary of the start of the Greek War of Independence, in partnership with Tovima and under the general title of Britain, Britons and the Greek Revolution. So as a valedictory to the Venizelos Library Talks series, at least until 2022, we are presenting to you tonight a lecture not on history or on politics, not on a single historical or artistic figure, but titled A Personal View of Greece, Britain and the Arts by Bruce Clark. Tovima is again our valuable partner and supporter for tonight's event. For those who may not be familiar with Bruce Clark's background, Bruce worked as a foreign news reporter over 4 decades with postings in Paris, Athens, Moscow and Washington. In 1982, he was sent to Greece by Reuters and spent 4 years there as the agency's first expatriate correspondent. Later, he covered the fall of Soviet communism for The Times, then worked for the Financial Times and The Economist and other publications focusing on history, culture and religion. His book, Twice a Stranger, about the Greek-Turkish population exchange, was co-winner of the Runciman Prize in 2007. In 2018, he was honoured by the Ecumenical Patriarch with the title of Archon Interpreter. Bruce is currently working on a history of Athens, which is due to be published next year. Bruce will offer us his personal perspective on Greek-British cultural interactions throughout the 20th century and particularly after World War II and their often unexpected results.
Well, I'm speaking to you from my family home in Northern Ireland, and it feels rather strange to be sitting close to the northwestern corner of Europe and yet thinking rather intensely about a language, a culture, a civilization that flourished in the southeast of Europe. And yet, as it happens, I'm not the first person in this part of the world to have been occupied with the Greek language. If you were to drive an hour west of here to the village of Fawn in County Donegal, you would see a stone monument, one of the oldest carved monuments standing in a churchyard in Ireland. There's an inscription on that stone monument, one of the oldest bits of writing we have in a churchyard in Ireland, and it's in Greek. And it says, "Glory and honor to the Father, Son and Holy Spirit," slightly misspelt, which lends authenticity. And even closer to home, there's another Hellenic connection, in the sense that one of the American founding fathers was born and grew up in this very place, in this very small farm, and he too was a Hellenist. Charles Thompson was his name. He arrived in the New World as a 10-year-old orphan, and it was thanks to his prowess in Greek and Latin that he actually gained entry to the elite circles of the young American Republic. He's a man I'm proud to be associated with because he had a much clearer vision than his friend Thomas Jefferson of the evils of slavery. And one of his big projects in life, apart from being Secretary of the American Congress, was to translate the Old and New Testaments of the Bible from Greek into English. He used the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, and he thought that the young American Republic should have its own Bible. He had been raised a Presbyterian, he was mentored politically by the Quakers, and his friends as fellow founders were mostly Anglicans, and he had the idea, perhaps the naive idea, that by sticking rigorously to the Greek text of the Bible, he could somehow rise above all these sectarian divisions. So I'm quite proud of that particular Greek connection. Now, in my childhood, it so happened that I twice left this place and was taken on trips to Greece. One was a road trip all the way from Dublin to the Peloponnese by ferry and road, whose culminating point was a visit to Patrick and Joan Lee Farmer at their then newly completed house, which was quite a memorable experience for 11-year-old me. And then a couple of years later, we had a sailing trip in a very battered old wooden yacht around the Greek islands, and the high point of that trip was a landing on Delos, which then as now felt like a place with a very powerful magnetic field that could suck you in and also throw you out at some unexpected angle. At the age of 17, as a school leaver, I found my way back to Greece, and like many young penniless Anglophones, I scraped a living by giving English lessons. And one of the surprises within literally a week or two of arriving in Athens was being invited by an older Greek couple to a film show at the British Council. And what we saw was a 1949 Ealing comedy called Kind Hearts and Coronets, starring Alec Guinness. All very enjoyable, but perhaps not quite what I was expecting in Athens. And I had the sense, perhaps, of catching the very tail end of an Anglo-Greek scene in Greece that was perhaps making a bit of light fun at its own expense by indulging these rather quaint and pickled in aspic images of Britain. Now, that was all a very long time ago, as you can imagine, and since then I've worked over the last 40 years for London-based news organisations, Reuters, The Times, the Financial Times, The Economist, and those organisations have sent me to Greece quite a lot. Now, the organisations themselves might prefer to call themselves international than British, but nonetheless they are perceived as British, especially in Greece, and so, willingly or not, I found myself an observer and maybe in some small way a protagonist in Greek-British relations, at least at a human level, over the past 40 years. Going back to my 17-year-old experience, one of the things I remember is that among middle-class, relatively well-educated Greeks, there was a tendency to know French and possibly German and sometimes not English. And I realized that in the 1930s, English had perhaps been the third language that people learned in Athens. Something else I noticed is that if somebody did speak good English, and perhaps several other languages too, there was quite a high chance that that person was a so-called Aegyptiotis, in other words, a member of the Greek community which had flourished in Egypt and then left en masse in the early 60s. That community had injected a new level of sophistication into Greece, and the effects in the mid-70s were still palpable. So, paradoxically enough, I think that a good place to start in any sort of cultural history of Greek-British interactions in the 20th century, perhaps going back even into the 19th century, is not so much Athens or any other city in Greece, but actually Cairo and Alexandria. Egypt was a setting in which Greeks and Britons interacted through business, through recreation, through education. And in cultural terms, perhaps the most important Greek-British meeting of all was the one between the novelist E.M. Forster and the Greek poet Constantine Cavafy, which took place in 1916. At that time, Cavafy was in his early 50s, living in the flat in the Rue Lipsius, which later became a small museum. And Forster, a young Englishman, was living in the Hotel Majestic. And Forster memorably describes how Cavafy seemed to him like a Greek gentleman standing motionless at a slight angle to the universe. And in practical terms, Cavafy would entertain Forster to cheese and maybe a glass of whiskey in his flat, and they would talk of Cavafy's poems. Now, Forster was an English public school product. He had public school Greek. He didn't know modern Greek. But gradually, through Cavafy's instruction, he began to understand a bit of Cavafy's modern Greek, and also to glimpse the vision behind Cavafy's poetry, a vision of Greekness which was more Hellenistic than Attic, and a vision that stretched way beyond the classical era. And that was a fateful meeting in literary terms, because ultimately it was through Forster's efforts to publicize Cavafy in the Anglophone world that Cavafy became perhaps the best known of all modern Greek poets. Greek-British relations in Egypt had an ultimately commercial basis. Greeks were making fortunes in the cotton trade, and Liverpool was one of the important centers of the international commerce in cotton. So there was a natural axis between Egypt and Liverpool, and indeed Cavafy's own family story reflects that axis. The very fact that Cavafy spoke very fluent English, and indeed Greek with a slight English accent, reflects his childhood spent partly in England. And one of the consequences of that commercial relationship was the educational scene in Egypt, where a whole raft of schools was founded which taught in a rather British way, with a rather British ethos, but which numbered wealthy Greeks among their governors, among their sponsors, among their patrons. And so you had this slightly bizarre combination of an Egyptian setting, Greek financing to some extent, and a very English ethos. If you had been, for example, at the English Girls' School in Alexandria in March 1941, you would have seen a pageant celebrating the most glorious moments of English and Greek literature and history. And you would have seen that the sponsors of that pageant were quite wealthy and prominent people from the English and Greek communities, respectively. And that was the school's way and the community's way of lending support to the war effort that was going on the Albanian front at that time. Remember, Greece was still successfully fighting Italy and bracing itself for the German attack at the very moment when that pageant was going on. Now, one of the bizarre things about these cultural relationships is that there are time lags. They continue to limp on, in a sense, even when the reasons that engendered them have ceased to exist. And so even after most British people left Egypt in the mid-50s as a result of the Suez Crisis, there were still schools there that taught their pupils in a very British way, and including a lot of British literature and history, which quite a number of Greek youngsters attended, because the Greek exodus from Egypt was quite a bit later. It was in the early, even the mid-60s. So that Greek-British-Egyptian relationship lingered in some ways remarkably long. But of course, the locus of Greek-British relations moved in 1944 from Egypt to Athens. That's an important part of history. And if there was one person who personified that relationship, one diplomat, it was Sir Reginald Leeper, Rex Leeper, who had been the ambassador to the Greek government in exile and then became the British ambassador in Athens. Now, it so happens that in the early 1930s, Leeper was also the person who lobbied successfully for the creation of the British Council. He argued that Britain should enter the field of cultural diplomacy, that it was lagging behind other countries, and at first he had quite a hard time convincing bureaucrats from other parts of the government that this would be a worthwhile use of public funds. But nonetheless, he did succeed, because even by the late 30s, by 1939, the British Council was functioning and flourishing in Athens. Now, as ambassador to newly liberated Athens, Leeper lobbied hard in London to make sure that the British Council would be restarted, that it would be treated as a high-level post, a Grade 1 post, and that it would attract people of very high quality from Britain to work for it. And so it's part of the history of both countries that in 1945 and afterwards, some very distinguished British individuals were called out to Greece to work for the British Council and generally to promote British thought and letters and arts in the Greek public, and indeed the English language as well. For example, there was the classicist and novelist Rex Warner. There was the great doyen of Byzantine studies, Stephen Runciman. The great master of classical studies in England, Maurice Barra, came out for an inspection visit. And then you also have the younger and more rambunctious figures of Lawrence Durrell and Patrick Leigh Fermor, returning now as a civilian. And both Durrell and Leigh Fermor found it rather difficult to adjust to a peacetime cultural bureaucracy. And Leigh Fermor was in fact sacked from his job in late 1946. That's all part of British history, in a sense, British cultural history. It's hard for me to say what role precisely it played in Greek cultural history. I would leave that to others. But nonetheless, that whole experience left a very palpable stamp on a generation of writers and academics from Britain. Now, the two Greek individuals who took it upon themselves to act as hosts and as educators about modern Greece to these incoming British luminaries were George Seferis, already a distinguished poet and somebody who had worked for the Greek government in exile in Egypt, and also George Katsimbalis, this larger-than-life polymath figure who had been made quite famous by Henry Miller's novel, The Colossus of Marousi. Both those men were very generous and perhaps very patient in sharing their knowledge of modern Greek literature and the arts, and perhaps bringing it home to those British newcomers that there was more to Greek culture than the classics. Certainly, anybody who had been exposed to the two Georges had no excuse for imagining that Greek culture ended with Homer or Euripides. Harold Macmillan, at the height of his friendship with John Kennedy, said that in the post-Cold War world, perhaps Britain could play Greece to America's Rome. In other words, America would provide the military might and the geopolitical heft in the Western world, and Britain would make up for her relative weakness with a very strong contribution in the field of culture as the land of Shakespeare and Milton and Dickens and so on. Well, if there was any country in which Britain did seriously try to play the role of Greece, it was, ironically enough, Greece itself. But of course, it would be a mistake to reduce the British-Greek story of the mid-20th century to transactions between men who were, broadly speaking, part of the political or social or cultural establishments of their respective countries. An equally important part in that story was played, for example, by two British women who married into and became protagonists of the Greek political left. And both their stories are quite remarkable. One of them was Marion Pascoe, an archaeologist who went out in the 1930s to work on a Greek island where she met an army officer, Stefanos Serafis, who was in internal exile because he had taken part in a leftist Republican coup in 1935. And they managed to keep in touch through the war and indeed through the early stages of the Civil War. Serafis by this time had become commander of EEST, the biggest of the resistance organizations, and he was again sent into internal exile in 1946 as left-right tensions mounted and the Civil War got underway. And Marion kept in touch with him throughout that period, and they eventually married in 1952 and after his release, and he became a member of parliament, and she was at his side during that period until his death in a mysterious car accident in 1957. Marion at that point went back to England and devoted quite a lot of the rest of her life to campaigning for leftist causes in Greece, in particular campaigning against the colonels who took power in 1967, and also through a small publishing house campaigning for a different reading of Greek history, one that was very critical of British policy. Another rather extraordinary story is that of Betty Ambatielos, Betty Bartlett as she was born, the daughter of a mine inspector, a communist, who in 1940 met a prominent Greek communist and leader of a Siemens trade union, Tony Ambatielos. They married, and she devoted the rest of her life to the Greek leftist cause. Her husband was condemned to death in the early part of the Civil War. Then that was commuted to life imprisonment, and she campaigned relentlessly for his release. Part of that campaign involved an encounter in the street with Queen Frederica in 1963, which cast quite a shadow at the time over British-Greek relations. When the colonels took power in 1967, both Tony Ambatielos and Betty were in Greece and they were arrested. Betty was released thanks to international pressure. She then spent the rest of that period campaigning for the overthrow of the colonels, one of many people in London who were doing that. Whatever assessment one makes of British policy during that period, it is part of the collective memory of Greeks and Britons of a certain generation that London served as a base for anti-colonials campaigning by Greeks of a remarkably broad ideological spectrum, including, of course, the very distinguished newspaper editor of the centre-right, Eleni Vlachou. But let's return to the world of officially sponsored cultural diplomacy, cultural activity in the broad sense, as it unfolded in the 1950s involving Britain and Greece. Now, it's in the nature of cultural diplomacy, and perhaps culture in general, that it attracts idiosyncratic individuals. After all, culture, if it's worth anything at all, is about delivering surprises. It's about saying the unsayable. It's about thinking the unthinkable. It's about speaking awkward truths. So it's not surprising that some of the characters who walk onto that stage are quite idiosyncratic. One of them was Philip Sherrard. Now, he, like many of that generation, came to Greece as a soldier, but he came as a reluctant soldier. He was just a modest lieutenant in the artillery, and he doffed his uniform with some relief in 1946. And when he entered the field of Greek studies, it was not through membership of any charmed circle, not through taverna evenings with glittering personalities. It was in the capacity of a fairly humble teacher and doctoral student based in England that he started writing to George Seferis, having become very interested in Seferis's poetry in particular and Greek poetry in general. And as you would expect, the early letters between Sherrard and Seferis are in an appropriately respectful and detached tone. There was no backslapping, no fraternizing over recital. This was a youngish student of Greek letters trying to establish a relationship with a man who was already very distinguished. Now, Sherrard's official connection with Greece deepened over time, with several spells as a member and then assistant director of the British School of Archaeology in Athens. But his connection with Seferis was, at least as it matured, above all, a human and personal one, albeit a very respectful one. The topic of their correspondence was very often matters of translation, fine matters of translation, because Sherrard, along with his collaborator Edmund Keeley, was in the process of becoming one of the definitive translators of Seferis, the Nobel laureate, into English. And Seferis himself was translating poets like Yeats and T.S. Eliot into Greek. So the two men had a lot to discuss when it came to the finer meaning of words and how difficult it was to translate them. But there was also something more paradoxical about the content of their exchanges. Sherrard used to say that it was modern Greek poetry and the poetry of Seferis in particular which had set him on the journey which led to his reception into the Orthodox Church. Now, there's quite a paradox there, because Seferis himself was an urbane member of the secular intelligentsia, of course formerly Greek Orthodox, but not especially religious, and a person who, like many Greeks of his class, would have seen the ancient Greek past mostly through the prism of the classical era and not of Christianity or Byzantium. So Seferis must have been quite bemused when Sherrard detected in his work a kind of spiritual dimension which wasn't obvious to Seferis himself. But then think about it a bit harder. In many ways, the genius of Seferis lay in fusing many layers of the Greek experience, right from the ancient past, the world of Homer, up to the present day. With a few simple words, he could somehow integrate and fuse the travels and travails of Odysseus and the suffering of the refugees sailing from Asia Minor ports in the 1920s. He had a kind of timeless vision of things. And of course, one of the layers that he was fusing consisted of the rituals, the annual cycle of the Orthodox Church, which is so deeply fused into the Greek experience that it hardly needs to be articulated. And so I think Sherrard was detecting something real when he saw that in Seferis's work. Above all, what Sherrard saw in Seferis and what he saw as lacking in the West was a kind of integration on many levels, integration of nature and man, integration of body and spirit, integration of different levels of consciousness, if you like. He saw Seferis the man and Seferis the poet as representing a kind of wholeness, a kind of integration, which is precisely what he saw disintegrating in the Western world. Now, Seferis used to say that he wished he could enter a dialogue with Sherrard at the same level, with the same pnoi, with the same breath as Sherrard's letters reflected. And he couldn't always do that because, frankly, the spiritual world that Sherrard was entering was rather a closed book. Sherrard became an enthusiast, for example, for theologians like Simeon, the new theologian, and that was something entirely new to Seferis. It was something he'd never heard of. So they were fishing in different waters, and yet I think that Sherrard was not wrong to detect a spiritual dimension in Seferis' writing, and I think that Seferis acknowledged this. He confided to Katsimbalis at one point that Sherrard interests me more than almost any other English person that he was in dialogue with. Of course, by that time, Seferis was a very busy man, an ambassador. He didn't have as much time for correspondence about matters of intellect as he would have liked or Sherrard would have liked. But nonetheless, it was an extraordinary dialogue between two people whose worlds overlapped but were nonetheless very different. And I think both would have said that they had learned a lot from each other. And you can trace the evolution of Sherrard's relationship with Seferis through an edited volume, which has been published by Sherrard's widow, Denise Harvey. And you can see precisely how what began as a very respectful relationship became one of real human warmth and closeness over time. But before moving on, it's worth mentioning that Sherrard was by no means the only Anglophone scholar whose relationship with Greece passed through the prism of Orthodox Christianity. There are, of course, many people I could mention in this connection, but let me single out two social scientists, both women, who did some extraordinary field work in traditional Greek communities in the late 60s and early 70s. One of them, Juliet Duboulé, did her work in a village in Evia in the late 60s, and the other, Renée Hirschon, did her work in Coquignac, which is a suburb of Piraeus, in the early 70s. And both show in an extraordinary way how the rituals and the calendar of the Orthodox Church and the almost unspoken beliefs of the Church are somehow expressed in community life in a way that doesn't always have to be articulated but can be articulated. Renée Hirschon in particular discovered that among the Asia Minor refugees of Coquignac there was a remarkably sophisticated theological understanding of the rituals that people engaged in, not only in church but perhaps particularly at home, when it came to blessing the house, when it came to care for the dead, when it came to hospitality. They had a sense of domestic ritual which was very much rooted in the beliefs and practices, sometimes articulated, sometimes almost unconscious, of the Church. And it so happens that both Juliet Duboulé and Renée Hirschon, in their private lives, so to speak, have become active, critical, and thoughtful members of the Orthodox Church. Psychotherapists can fall in love. It's also perfectly permissible and to be expected that social scientists will have sometimes an existential relationship with the realities that they study without, in any sense, sacrificing any of their academic rigor. The other person I'd like to single out as a member of the Anglo-Greek, British Greek world, and a member of other worlds too, is Louis MacNeice, who stayed in Greece quite a short time, from January 1950 to the autumn of 1951, but nonetheless spent a very significant time there from the point of view of literary history, a significant moment in the life of a great poet and writer of the 20th century. Louis MacNeice grew up in the world of Anglican Northern Ireland, a bit like me, you might say. His father was a clergyman, ultimately a bishop, but he was rather atypical among the Anglican clergy in the sense that he came from the west of Ireland and he had a strong nostalgia for the west of Ireland, and neither he nor his wife could readily get accustomed to the somewhat harsher environment of Northern Ireland. It was said of Louis MacNeice that he was brought up in mourning for a place he had never been to. He picked up his parents' nostalgia for the west of Ireland, and indeed he effectively lost his mother at the age of 6. So he was doubly in mourning for a place and a person. That made for a personality which was highly intelligent, but also restless, anxious, skeptical, somebody who could easily see the negative in things, and somebody who was no romantic either about ancient Greece or modern Greece, although he knew a lot about both. When he arrived in Greece, he was already a distinguished broadcaster. He had made programs for BBC Radio, including about Greece, as part of the wartime propaganda effort. He was an accomplished poet, and he was a classical scholar. He had worked for the University of Birmingham. In fact, he had been hired for that university by a fellow Ulsterman, E.R. Dodds. And so there wasn't much you could teach in a formal sense, MacNeice, about the classics by the time he arrived in Athens. He wasn't some eager British soldier with public school Greek. He already had a formidable body of learning underneath him. Now, he worked very hard in Greece. He delivered public lectures. He arranged visits by distinguished people in both directions, from Greece to Britain, from Britain to Greece. He toured the country. He went, for example, to Ikaria. He never suffered from any romanticism about Athens. He used to complain humorously about the endless popping of horns and the cocks crowing and so on. He wasn't that kind of Philhellene, but nonetheless he brought an enormous and sophisticated baggage to his perception of both ancient and modern Greece. And he wrote 10 remarkable poems while he was in Greece, published as a collection called 10 Burnt Offerings. There's one of them entitled Areopagus, which gives you a glimpse of the conflicting versions of Hellenism that were, as it were, bubbling inside him. Now, the Areopagus, which he would have visited often as a resident in Athens, has two associations for somebody of MacNeice's background. It's both the place where St. Paul preached to the Athenians and where he told the clever Athenian philosophers that he, St. Paul, would speak to them of the unknown God, the God which they were aware of but only dimly perceived. He would speak to them of that God and bring alive in them something that was already dimly on the horizon. That is one very powerful association that the Areopagus would have for anybody of clerical background like MacNeice. But the other association, of course, is the story of the Furies or the Eumenides, the story that is told by the playwright Aeschylus, the story which in fact MacNeice had translated. He'd actually been involved in staging Agamemnon, so he's very familiar with the Orestias cycle. Now, in the final part of that cycle, Orestes is put on trial for the murder of his mother, Clytemnestra, although that murder has actually been an act of family obligation, because he's punishing Clytemnestra for having murdered Agamemnon, that's Orestes' father. In any case, Orestes is tried for this act, and he is acquitted. And in the process, these fiendish creatures, the Furies, turn into benign creatures, the kindly ones, the Eumenides, and this is supposed to symbolize the emergence of earthly justice as a substitute for revenge and vendetta and so on. And this was, in ancient Greek terms, a symbol of the role of the Areopagus, the highest court, as a place where objective justice was meted out, earthly justice was meted out, and personal passions no longer had to play a role. So St. Paul was speaking of a triumph over law, in a sense, the triumph of grace over law, whereas the ancient Greek story tells the triumph of law over more primitive forms of behavior. And all these things would have been intensely in the consciousness of Louis MacNeice as he visited the Areopagus. It's worth for a moment digressing and saying that he was not the first British visitor to feel that tension on visiting the Areopagus. In fact, almost exactly a century before he went there, Florence Nightingale paid a visit to the Areopagus, and she writes in her diary that on one day, one particular Sunday, she heard a sermon from an Anglican cleric about St. Paul's preaching in the Areopagus, and on the following day she went and inspected the cave which the Eumenides were supposed to inhabit. the Furies who turned into kindly ones. So, first Florence Nightingale and then Louis MacNeice felt on the Areopagus this tension between the rock's classical associations and its Christian associations. And I'll read a line or two from his poem that give you a sense of how he understood that tension. It's obvious from the poem that MacNeice is not completely convinced that the Furies have been successfully transformed into benign creatures. He thinks they may still be squirming somewhere underground. Beneath in the cave, once avenging, later beneficent, with tousled vipers, gravestone eyes, the kind ones turned in their sleep. He whetted the blade of the wit of their faith to slice their pagan prides to the quick. They nudged and doubted. Diamond cut diamond, something new. MacNeice was not a naive or uncritical enthusiast for Greece, or indeed for anything at all, but he could recognize passionate Philhellenism in others, and indeed he recognized that quality in a young American writer whom he met at that time. That was Kevin Andrews. And part of the body of MacNeice's correspondence from those months in Athens is a letter of recommendation for Kevin Andrews, in which he writes, he would be the ideal person to write a book about modern Greece, or the modern Greeks, of whom he seems to have an almost uncanny understanding. He has the great advantage of being able to speak Demotic Greek so naturally that a peasant in the Peloponnese would take him for a Greek from another district. By that stage, Kevin Andrews and Louis MacNeice were part of a new crowd of Britain's English speakers, Americans, who were perhaps enjoying the tavernas of Athens and kicking around some ideas and forming a new little micro-society. But in this connection, I'd like to talk about Kevin Andrews for a second. He wasn't British, but he'd been to a British public school, Stowe. In fact, his parents were Americans who lived in China, and he didn't particularly belong to any country. And I suppose he found in Greece the homeland that he lacked. When he arrived in Greece in 1947, he took to the place very, very quickly. He toured the Peloponnese, notionally to investigate the fortresses and castles, but also simply talking to people in a very empathetic way. This was a time when the wounds of the Second World War were still open, and new traumas with the Civil War were opening up. And he had extraordinary powers of sympathy and a listening ear and great linguistic skills, which enabled him to write one of the great books about Greece in the 20th century, The Flight of Icarus. Now, it seems to me there's a very important distinction to be drawn between two broad categories of English-speaking writers about Greece. In one camp, you have people who address Greece from a fairly safe distance. Even if they spent a long time in Greece, nonetheless they had a certain detachment and a very keen awareness of what the public at home might want. And in the other camp, you have writers who really became intoxicated by Greece, almost to the point of losing all perspective, almost to the point of not being able to communicate quite coherently with an English-speaking audience, but nonetheless, in the process, acquiring a great depth of understanding that only comes with vulnerability to the wounds and pain of Greece, as well as to the pleasures and amusements. Now, in that second category, I would place Kevin Andrews, I would place Philip Sherrard, I would also, paradoxically enough, place Peter Levi, although he's known for many things besides his Greek work, professor of poetry, a man who spent very significant years in Greece in the 60s and 70s, but nonetheless spent the latter part of his life back in England. I would say that in his book, The Hill of Kronos, he shows an intensity of engagement with Greece, an intensity of engagement with both the landscape and the human and personal and political struggles of Greece, which is very much of the second category I have in mind. Somebody who risked his own person for Greece in a way. I'm reminded of the thing that Sophocles said about love, he who has it has gone mad, or dechon meminen. And it seems to me there's a category of writers who go slightly mad as a result of their encounter with Greece. I would say that Andrews was one, I would say that Sherrard was one, I would also say that Peter Levi was one. And you can feel that risky intoxication in a kind of manifesto for Hellenists that ranks as a seminal piece of writing in the works of Philip Sherrard. It's called The Wound of Greece, and of course the reference is to a line in Seferis, wherever I go, Greece is wounding me. This is what Sherrard writes. He says that anybody who wants a real understanding or experience of Greece must have sought out not the past but the living present of Greece, which is not a doom but a destiny, a process rather, in which the present and the past blend and fuse, in which nature, man, and something more than man participate. A process difficult, baffling, enigmatic, with its element of magic, its element of tragedy, working itself out in a landscape of bare hills and insatiable sea, in the miraculous cruelty of the summer sun, and in the long generations of the lives of the Greek people. And you might say, it's a long way from that passion to the rather predictable world of officially sponsored film shows, concerts, exhibitions, cultural events. Is the gap unbridgeable between officially sponsored culture and the kind of culture that gets us into deep and dangerous waters? Well, not always. Let me share with you one of my vivid memories from working as a journalist in Greece in the 1980s. Now, it so happens that the British Council, to celebrate its own 50th anniversary, sponsored a tour of a production of a restoration comedy, The School for Scandal. It had played very successfully in London, and thanks to the council, it was brought round Europe. And the lead actor was Donald Sinden. Now, it so happened that literally a few days before the production in Greece was due to be seen, the head of the British Council in Greece at that time, Ken Whitty, and his Greek assistant, Artemis Economidou, were both assassinated by the Abu Dinal terrorist group. It was a time when they were carrying out assassinations all over the Middle East, and as far as we can tell anything, it was a mistaken targeting of this very decent and hard-working person. And the incident was very traumatic for the diplomatic community and the press community even at the time in Athens. But in such circumstances, the show must go on. And indeed, the show did go on. And as the performance began, Donald Sinden came out and he said, "We dedicate this performance to good cultural relations between Greece and Britain." Then ask yourselves, what does the School for Scandal actually mean? Is it just an amusing exercise in salon sarcasm and wit? Is it just people in powdered wigs making amusing remarks to each other? No, actually I think it's a bit more than that. I think perhaps helped by the fact that Sheridan, the author, was an Irishman, the son of an Irish actor. It takes rather a witty and perceptive look at London society in the late 18th century. It takes a very witty look at what Ibsen would call bourgeois marriage as a kind of financial contract. And it's much, much funnier than anything Ibsen wrote. It's more like Aristophanes, if you like. If you want to read The School for Scandal at a certain level, it's a very witty and acerbic and quite penetrating commentary on life as it was lived among the rich and the nouveau riche of London in the 18th century. And it has a much wider application than that. So who knows what seeds were sown, what thoughts were provoked during that performance on a March day in 1984. Certainly, it wasn't just a tame and predictable cultural event. It was an event that will have had all kinds of unpredictable consequences for the people of all generations that were watching it. Thinking about Greek-British relationships in the sphere of culture has made me think a bit about relationships in general, human relationships, both individual or collective. And it seems to me that one of the characteristics of relationships is that they produce offspring which are often entirely different than anything that the parties to that relationship ever imagined or intended. At a very micro-human level, two people can get together and have children, and those children can have characteristics which are not immediately recognizable to either parent. That's part of the joy and the hazard of parenthood, I suppose. But it's also true of any collective enterprise that whenever two groups of people get together supposedly for a common purpose, it's almost invariably true that the net result of that collaboration is something different, often something even better than either party imagined. That's in the nature of human collaboration. It's in the nature, if you like, of human reproduction in the broader sense of the word, that collaboration always has unintended effects. And sometimes those unintended effects, sometimes those side effects are much more interesting than the intended effects, if indeed those intended effects happen at all. So let's go back to the beginning. For somebody who was tracing the broad contours of history in Egypt or Britain or Greece, the figures of Cavafy and Forster would have seemed very unimportant. Cavafy, a very badly paid clerk for the civil service, Forster, a struggling young man working for the ambulance service, neither of them people of any consequence in the world, and yet their meeting had fateful results for literary history. It literally was a landmark in the story of letters and culture in the early 20th century. Nobody could have foreseen that. When a reluctant soldier called Philip Sherrard came to Greece and then was discharged from the army in 1946, nobody could possibly have imagined that he would become an interpreter of Orthodox theology as it pertains to man and the environment, or indeed a translator of a Nobel Prize winning poet. None of the things were perceived or foreseen or planned in advance. They were all entirely unintended consequences, at least from any human perspective. When a young archaeologist called Marian Pascoe went out to the Greek islands, nobody ever imagined that she would become the wife of a resistance commander and then a politically engaged publisher and historian. That again was outside anybody's program. When a young Greek woman called Amalia went on a British Council scholarship in the late 40s to engage in her field, which was bacteriology, nobody knew that she would marry a world-famous scientist, Sir Alexander Fleming, or that she herself would become a distinguished politician in later life. Perhaps the most concrete result of the British Council's activities in Greece after the Second World War are that thousands and thousands of people learnt English to a very high standard. The Council was not only giving its own lessons, it was also certifying the lessons given by other people. It set a standard for English teaching in Greece, and that's part of the reason why so many young Greeks went successfully to study in England. They were part of the British university scene, not only as students but ultimately as professors and indeed in several recent Greek governments, a remarkably high number of ministers have been products of the British university system, not just alumni, but actually active academics within the British university system. And all that, directly or indirectly, is a consequence of the seeds that were sown in the late 40s, 50s by the British Council, so you could argue, and a very welcome and noble consequence, you might say. Something even more substantial than showings of kind hearts and coronets. One of the cultural projects between Greece and Britain that is closest to my heart is something called the Athena Music Scholarship, which is a voluntary project, and it helps young Greeks, very talented young Greeks, to study at the Royal Academy of Music. They could be composers, singers, players of any instrument, and one of the nice things about these scholarships is that it leads young Greeks into a world where almost inevitably they will form collaborations and personal friendships with other people from different countries in the very rich and cosmopolitan world of the Royal Academy, and that's all part of the fun. So, to speak personally for a moment, about 18 months ago, I had the pleasure and the fun of organising a concert in this part of the world in aid of a mental health charity, and I invited a young Athena scholar, Michael Iskas, a violinist, to play with his collaborator, who was a young Spanish accordionist, as they have played at many top venues in London, including the Wigmore Hall. And I introduced them to a local friend of mine, an Irish harpist. And literally, I can report that within a few minutes, within half an hour anyway, of the three of them meeting, they were making some really wonderful music together. That was outside anyone's program. It was not music that anybody had composed or set them as an exercise. It's just an example of what can happen when three talented musicians from three different countries playing three very different instruments get together and stimulate one another and spark off their talent. So let's celebrate cultural diplomacy, officially sponsored culture, in the knowledge that it will lead us to all manner of unexpected and perhaps hazardous places. It will have consequences that nobody can imagine. Of course, cultural diplomacy is engaged in for relatively safe reasons, I suppose, because countries want to promote their own images, they want to promote good feelings about themselves, but the very definition of culture is something that touches people's heart and makes them think differently, and perhaps sets them off on entirely new trajectories that as the sponsor of a cultural event, as the sponsor of a cultural program or course or exchange, you cannot possibly predict. So let's hope for much more cultural diplomacy. Let's hope, whether it's private or public, whether it's government sponsored or privately sponsored, and let's hope for many more highly unexpected results.
Many thanks to Bruce for an extremely interesting and thought-provoking lecture. It's a real pity that he was not able, for technical reasons, to be with us live and reply to questions. Let's hope that we will have that opportunity sometime in the future. Many thanks to all of you for your interest and to our partners, Tovima, again, for their support. Now, in a real physical lecture, this will be the time that I would invite you all to join Bruce and me for a drink here at the residence, when we could discuss his observations over a glass of wine and some music. Well, we can't host a reception or give you a glass of wine, although I sincerely hope you are having one at home, but we can provide the music. We are extremely lucky to have the distinguished pianist, Mr. Manos Kitsikopoulos, to play for us tonight. His music selection will be 8 Island Dances for Piano by George Konstantinidis, passages from The Little White Clam, Mikri Levki Achivada by Manos Hadjidakis, and to include the British element, 2 piano variations of his own on themes by the Beatles, Norwegian Wood and Eleanor Rigby. A little about Manos himself. He was born in Athens. He studied piano and musicology in Athens. He continued his studies doing a Master of Arts degree at the Royal Academy in London under Joanna McGregor, winning the honorary title Dip Ram Award. He conducted his studies in London on a scholarship from the Onassis Foundation and the Athena Scholarship, as well as the Life Action Trust. As Greek-British cultural relations is tonight's theme, we're very proud that Mr. Kitsikopoulos benefited from the support of the Athena Scholarship Scheme. The Athena Scholarship is a privately funded scholarship helping musically gifted students from Greece throughout their studies at the Royal Academy of Music. Beneficiaries come from a wide variety of disciplines, including singing, composition, and various instruments. The scholarship has been in existence for 8 years, and the active support of the Royal Academy has also, of course, been vital to the scholarship's success. And in case you were wondering what the connection between Bruce's lecture and Manos's music is this evening, apart from Greek-British links in the arts, it's because Bruce himself has been a strong supporter and friend to the Athena Scholarship Programme and the scholars themselves, including Manos. Manos, thank you, and Bruce, thank you again for your contribution and participation. So friends, thank you for your interest in tonight's event. I hope you all enjoyed it. We're looking forward to seeing as many of you at our upcoming events, either digitally or, we sincerely hope, in person in the not too distant future. We will keep you posted on our plans. Good evening.